Hi, I'm Dushyanthi Satchi, and I am a clinical psychotherapist and policy analyst. And we are going to talk today about postpartum depression and look at a cross-cultural perspective. So, my interest in this subject started when I was in grad school because as an intern in my first year, I was put in the OBGYN department at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital to do my rotations. And my supervisor told me, because we were mainly treating postpartum depression every day, talk to them about self-care, getting sleep, getting exercise, spending time with their partner, some of the typical sort of recommendations we give to patients who experience depression. So I remember this woman sitting in front of me and she was crying and she was a young mother. She was an immigrant with no family around. And she was telling me how she was feeling exhausted and hopeless. And I suggested self care. And she looked at me and she said, "Self care, I don't have time to shower." And I was like, "Oh, right, right." And I was like, "Okay, so who could you ask to be with the baby while you take a shower?" And she's like, "I don't have anyone. My family is all the way in Ecuador." So it really left an impression on me because at that moment, what I was being taught, which was that clinical psychotherapy and medications were the first line treatment for postpartum depression. And even if you look at Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, all the information coming out of the NIH, that is still the recommendation for first line treatment for postpartum depression. And I realized this isn't working and this isn't what they need. So fast forward about 15 years later, and my sister, who is a pediatrician who had been caring for newborns for about 10 years, got pregnant and had her first baby. And she's one of the strongest people I know. She hardly ever sheds a tear. And I saw her in those cold February Connecticut months sliding into a depression. And she didn't say anything, she never complained, but I could tell by her affect that she just wasn't there. So I invited her to come spend a month in California, where I live, with me. And she came. And we had a month together that was amazing. We took walks in the California sunshine. We took turns bathing the baby and putting him to sleep. We shared the household chores. We were really partners and we had a great time. And when I asked her about this experience, she said, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think I was experiencing postpartum depression, but I didn't experience it in California. So I asked her, in your words, what was different about California? And what she said was, I had support. We could share household responsibilities, we could tag team with the baby, and I had companionship. We had the shared joy of taking care of a child as well as connecting with each other apart from the baby. And what I hear from a lot of new mothers is that that's difficult to do with their husbands because their husbands often have to go right back to work. And a lot of times the mothers say the husbands just don't get it. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit more. But in California, we created this situation that seemed to just magically alleviate her depression. And I thought, is it really this simple? Is the support, some sunshine, some exercise, a little extra sleep while someone else watches the baby? Is that really the cure for postpartum? So, postpartum depression affects 1 in 5 women in the US, and it is wildly underreported. Studies show up to 90% of new moms experience what's called the baby blues. And there's very similar symptoms between the two, with postpartum depression being a more extreme version. So, postpartum depression, it's actually sometimes called perinatal depression because it can actually begin during pregnancy and it can last up to a year. And it's very similar to clinical depression symptoms, where it's depressed mood, anhedonia, where you lose your interest in doing the things that you typically like to do, um, loss of appetite, disturbances in sleep, difficulty focusing and concentration, crying spells. And additionally, that with postpartum depression, there is a anxiety around having the baby and the fear that maybe you don't want the baby. And in more severe cases, there's actually thoughts of harming yourself or harming the baby. And when I spoke to my sister about this on a clinical level, because she is a pediatrician, um, what she said was that, they use the Edinburgh postnatal depression scale to monitor depression. And what she said is the accuracy is hardly questioned. And in my research, what I saw is that this scale's not even used in the UK because they don't feel it's accurate. And she said within the first month, depression is expected. That if you get a positive score, that's considered normal, but it's flagged to go to a therapist if someone is suicidal or mentions that they want to harm the baby. So I hear from moms that they don't want to actually be honest on those questionnaires because they don't want to say anything that might get the baby taken away from them. So it is, based on my clinical experience, based on the research, talking to other clinicians, it is a wildly underreported phenomenon. So even though society, when someone's about to have a baby, focuses on the joyful aspects, and it is joyful, there is within clinicians, and for most women who've had a baby, an understanding that there's going to be emotional highs and lows and depression. And this focus on the positive within society makes it really difficult for moms to admit that they're depressed. They start feeling guilty that they're having those thoughts. They start having shame. And it makes it difficult for dads to understand that it's even happening so they can be vigilant and looking out and understand how to support their wives. Um, Untreated postpartum depression can create difficulty bonding with the baby, and long-term postpartum depression can lead to cognitive, emotional, developmental, and verbal deficits in the child, and also impaired social skills. It can lead to problems in marriage, and it's overall just a miserable experience for the mom because she's ashamed to talk about it, so she can't get the support that she needs. So the question becomes, is this hormonal? Because a lot of women tell me, well, I hear that it's hormonal, so I just went with the ups and downs, and I didn't actually think of it as a clinical depression. And there is a sharp, rapid drop after childbirth of estrogen and progesterone that contribute to PPD, postpartum depression. And there are studies that breastfeeding is a protective factor because it stimulates oxytocin in the woman's brain, which is a happy neurotransmitter. It creates feelings of closeness, bonding, joy. However, there are also a lot of studies that report that 1 in 10 men experience postpartum depression. So we haven't started talking about the men yet. We're expecting the men to be supportive of their partners. But 1 in 10 men are also experiencing postpartum depressions. And there are also plenty of studies that state that adoptive parents also experience postpartum depression in the same rates as biological parents. So clearly, there's more at play than just the hormonal shift. And I do believe it is a factor, but there are more factors at play. So if you look at the standard of treatment in the West, you will see, as I mentioned, the primary treatment is therapy and medication. But, if you look even like on the Cleveland Clinic website, it'll say prioritize rest, go out with your friends, limit your visitors, exercise, fall asleep in time, and make time for self-care and time with your partner. The problem is this is impossible to do without extra hands and extra support. It would be great, but it's just not possible when a lot of women are left home with the baby on their own. Less than half of the 1 out of 5 women who do report postpartum depression are not getting treatment. So the rest of them are definitely not getting treatment. So according to World Health Organization, if we want to zoom out and take a macro look, the World Health Organization states that in most developed countries, the numbers are 1 in 10 women experience postpartum depression. And in developing countries, it's 1 in 5 women. So what that tells us, according to those numbers, is that socioeconomic conditions and poverty contribute to postpartum depression. However, when you look at the national rates in each country, that data doesn't add up. So, for example, in the US, we're a developed country, we have the 1 in 5 ratio. There's also a 1 in 5 ratio in the UK, which is also a developed country. So, you start to question, is it really about socioeconomic resources? Most of the studies that look at this are done on middle class white participants, like the majority of psychology studies. And the cross cultural studies are wildly conflicting, and they have such severe limitations, just even based on language. The words postpartum depression are not always used globally, and the way women describe how they feel is not the same as it is in the West. And a lot of the studies are done through meta-analysis of are done through a lot of the studies are done through meta-analysis of, lots of studies who were done by different people in different parts of the world. So there's no consistency and there's no control. However, if you look at the research from medical anthropologists, and medical anthropologists, thank goodness for that field, because that's the only field that gives us a glimpse into what's actually happening in other parts of the world. And what that is, it's the study of how health and illness are shaped by culture, by time, and by politics. And they do qualitative review and they quantify it. So they do a lot of interviewing and then they put numbers to it. And they are very specific about language that can apply cross-culturally. It has a different sensitivity. And they say that this morbid unhappiness and this loneliness is reported across the board, but happiness is connected to a strong social support. So this one qualitative study in postpartum rituals, it had 51 different studies across 20 countries, showed that specifically in East Asia, South Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, there are social support rituals for a longer period of time in the West. So there's a 30 to 40 day period in most of these cultures because it's sort of a precarious period for a woman. And it's to prevent future illnesses, to reduce maternal mortality rates, which can be higher. And during those periods, the woman does not cook, she does not clean, she is surrounded by women in the community, she is surrounded by her extended family, by the mother-in-law, by birth attendants, by midwives, and they are giving her advice, they are giving her support, and they help her transition into this new stage of life. There is an understanding that with this transition comes a lot of joy and a lot of difficulty. And there is much more of a rite of passage to support not just the infant, but the mother. And there is a lot of organized support, periods of rest. There's lots of eyes on the mother. I spoke to someone who is a Peace Corps volunteer and now works in the New York City Department of Education, who lived in the Gambia in West Africa. And she said there's just a lot of eyes on the mother because someone is always watching and a lot of eyes on the baby. The whole village comes to visit. So they're able to say, let me hold the baby so you can rest. Here, you hold the baby because you need the baby. Don't think too much about that. Why don't you just stop? Why don't you eat something? So there's always a sense of support versus what I hear here in the West all of the time is feeling very isolated and alone. And not to mention the socioeconomic barrier, people who can afford round the clock care are a very small group within this country. So you have within Japanese culture, you have a pregnant woman moving in with the mom or the in-laws before the birth up until months after. In Korea, they have a government sanctioned postpartum helper who's trained to massage the mom, teach her about breastfeeding. You have now in Korea these sort of spas that almost look like hotels. They're high end and they're expensive, and they're popping up in New York and LA too, where they get yoga and facials and massage. You have Mexican women who have a 40-day of rest period. So this is sort of a worldwide phenomenon that we're missing in the West. And there's an understanding that the body has gone through a major process. You need to heal to prevent illness. And it allows the mother to be mothered to protect her future capacity for mothering. So it's very different than Western medicine, where we focus on infant care. There's more of a restoration on maternal health. And you have, within Western care, like within the first 6 weeks after the hospital, there's one visit for the mom versus this everyday attention. So even in countries like in Europe, they have doulas. Sometimes they have government the government sends and pays for doulas in France, in the UK, in Germany to watch the mom and to give her a sense of support. When you look at this from a policy perspective, you wonder, does the US not have this because we have a lower maternal mortality rate? We do have a lower maternal mortality rate than most countries in the world. However, among developed countries, we have a high maternal mortality rate. So if you compare it to New Zealand, which has 1.7 deaths of mothers per 100,000 live births, we have 22. And according to the CDC, 4 out of 5 of those deaths would be preventable with better postpartum care. So, and since more than half of those deaths occur after birth, the WHO, the World Health Organization, recommends at least 4 health contacts with the mom. And here in the US, we're getting 1. So, for maternity leave in this country, we are the only first world country without guaranteed paid maternity, paternity, or parental leave at a national level. The only one of any first world country, yet we have the highest GDP in the world. There's only 7 countries in the world that don't offer this, and we are one of the 7, along with Papua New Guinea and some countries in the Pacific Islands. What we do have is FMLA, family and medical leave. So you can either get sick or have a baby. I guess you have to choose in this country, and it's not mandated that it's paid by the employer. No paternity leave. The husbands usually get back to work right away. And in this country, in over half of the homes, which is different to developing countries, we have the women providing 40% of the household income. So that means you're losing 40% of your household income. You have the pressure to get back to work. You don't have the income at that time to get extra help. It is an insane amount of pressure on the family. So the clinical and policy implications is that you see in the studies that when you have postpartum support, you have decreased postpartum depression. You know that paid and longer maternity leave is associated with lower postpartum depression. And we know from the Harvard Happiness Study, the longest study on happiness that started in the 1930s going strong, that relationships make you healthier and stronger. So the recommendations and the number one thing that women say that helps them is support, psychoeducation prior to the birth, after the birth for men and women, screening beyond a piece of paper, maternity leave, and paternity leave. So, just in closing, I'm just going to paint you a picture. I'm going to paint you 3 pictures. So, I want you to imagine that you just gave birth and you are in the Gambia in West Africa in a rural African village. For a month, you have either no work or very light work. You have 1,000 people coming and going, mainly women in the room with you. You don't leave. People come there to do the checkups on the baby. After that month, there's not a lot of extra cost to have the baby because the baby sleeps with you and eats what you eat, and all you need is a piece of cloth to tie the baby to your back and go into the field. You're already in a communal style of living, so it's not a huge adjustment. Chores and cooking are already on a rotation within the community that you live in. Second picture. You just had a baby, except you're in Germany. You have a doula who's guided you through the pregnancy before, during, and after to answer your questions about nutrition, breastfeeding, if you've gained too much weight. They come to your house. While you're in the hospital, you get physical therapy about how to walk and how to move. If you can't get out of bed, there's someone who comes and bathes you in bed. The dining hall is an actual dining hall, so you can actually walk there and you can go and your family can come and you can sit at a table and have a breakfast buffet and play cards and the baby can be right next to you. Once you get home, the doula continues to support you with any questions that you need and comes there to check the baby. And scenario 3, you have a baby, but you're in America. You have a rush 3-day stay in the hospital where you get the best medical technological care in the world. You have no physical therapy. The baby is often in the nursery and you feel a little bit like they're trying to rush you home because insurance won't pay for more days. You have a rush of visitors in the first 2 weeks, mainly to see the baby and not to check on you. And then you are left with the majority of the housework, cooking, and cleaning, and stressed. And even though you're not supposed to drive for 2 to 3 weeks after you're a baby and 6 weeks if you've had a C-section, you're supposed to go to see your pediatrician within 3 days, even though your husband's at work and you may or may not have family around. Which scenario would you choose? Can we transition this season to thinking of it as a sacred transition for the mom and the baby that is going to be joy as well as difficulty, as well as sadness, and where the mother will need to recover physically and emotionally and need the guidance of the other women in the community, and the fathers get education about it? And can we start learning from the wisdom of other women and prepare women for a lifetime of mothering?
That was amazing. So, just taking a moment to think about what you've said and shared, and the material is just remarkable and resonates with the conference and community and what we share here and our principles. And I think if there's no questions, you can connect with Dushyanthi in our chat and her email and follow her online. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you all for coming to the conference. This is our last session, but what a great way to end it and celebrate 5 years of the Women's Mental Health Conference at Yale. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And you can find me on Instagram. That's where I do a lot of my posting.